Welcome to a forgotten chapter of history, the Singapore Mutiny of 1915. This event, often overshadowed by the larger narrative of World War I, was a dramatic and significant moment that exposed cracks in British colonial rule in the continent. This isn't just a story of rebellion. It's a poignant reminder of the interconnected struggles for freedom across the globe. For South Asia, the Singapore Mutiny holds a special significance. It highlighted the simmering discontent among colonial troops and foreshadowed the growing push for independence across the Indian subcontinent. The mutiny also revealed how global events, like World War I and anti-colonial movements, shaped the lives and decisions of those far from the battlefields of Europe. This forgotten tale is a window into the aspirations and struggles of a bygone era, reminding us how deeply connected the histories of Singapore and South Asia truly are. Join us as we explore the untold story of the Singapore Mutiny and its lasting significance. Back in October 1914, the Indian Army's 5th Light Infantry Regiment was shifted from Madras to Singapore. They'd been sent there as a replacement for the King's own Yorkshire Light Infantry, which was being deployed to France. This regiment had been around since 1803, and what made it stand out at that time was that it was entirely made up of Muslim soldiers, something not very common in 1914-15. But things weren't smooth for the regiment. There was poor communication between the sepoys and their officers. Discipline was slack and leadership was lacking, all of which left the troops feeling pretty discontented. Adding fuel to the fire was the Ghadar Party. Pertinently, this event was closely tied to the Indian independence movement, often referred to by the British as the Ghadar Conspiracy. The Ghadar movement aimed to create unrest in the Indian Army, using the soldiers' discontent as a spark for rebellion. In fact, just a month before the Singapore Mutiny, a similar plan involving the 130th Baluchis had been uncovered and stopped thanks to a timely warning. Their appeal reached the soldiers in Singapore and only made them more dissatisfied. The situation became even more volatile because of specific issues within the regiment. A lot of it revolved around Lieutenant Colonel E.V. Martin, who'd recently been promoted from Major to take command. The previous colonel had warned that Martin wasn't well liked by his fellow officers and didn't command much respect from the men. Despite that, he got the promotion, and his appointment caused a lot of friction. British officers were at odds over it, and that tension trickled down to the Indian officers too. Under normal circumstances, these kinds of issues might not have caused too much trouble. But with the Ghadar Party's influence and Turkey's entry into the war, things took a darker turn, and the discontent started boiling over. It was a perfect storm of internal grievances and external pressures that led to the mutiny. It was Monday, February 15th, 1915, Chinese New Year, when the Indian 5th Light Infantry mutinied in Singapore. This regiment, made up entirely of Muslim soldiers, was the backbone of the island's garrison at the time. Around 3 p.m., chaos erupted. Shots were fired, the regiment broke into the ammunition magazine, and they cut the military phone lines, throwing the place into turmoil. Most of the regiment's British officers were off duty, either relaxing at home or enjoying themselves on the beach, so it took a while for word of the uprising to spread. Oddly enough, no one seemed to think to inform the police about what was happening. One group of rebels marched towards Chinatown, attacking and killing any British people they came across. Another group made their way to a nearby battery, which was being guarded by locally recruited Sikh soldiers from the Malay States Guides. The rebels killed the British officer in charge and tried to arm the Sikhs, but most of them decided to flee into the jungle instead of joining in. The biggest and most determined group of mutineers headed west to Tanglin Camp, where 307 German internees and prisoners of war were being held. They offered the Germans weapons and their freedom. However, in a twist that revealed how deeply rooted colonial hierarchies were, the Germans turned them down. As one naval lieutenant reportedly said, "A German officer does not fight without his uniform or alongside mutineers." Still, a few of the prisoners, mostly businessmen and some military men, did take the chance to escape. Over the next couple of days, the fighting spread across Singapore. In the chaos, 47 soldiers and civilians were killed. 5 of them were Chinese or Malay, but the majority were British men. They were attacked on golf courses, in cars, and even in carriages. Meanwhile, their wives and children fled, crowding onto steamers in the harbor for safety. This led to an ugly scene when Eurasian and Asian women also tried to board, only to face racial hostility. For 2 days, the British completely lost control of Singapore. It was a shocking moment that exposed just how fragile their colonial rule really was. A week after the mutiny, the British managed to take 614 Indian troops into custody. 52 men had been killed during the chaos, but around 150 were still missing. Many of them tried to hide among the local South Asian population, pretending to be cattle keepers, while others fled across the causeway to Johore in the Malay Peninsula. One of the main leaders of the uprising was caught as far as 200 miles away. It wasn't until March 8th that life in Singapore started to return to normal. The golf clubs even reopened. By May, only a handful of rebels were still on the run. But privately, British officials admitted how close they had come to losing everything. Their biggest fear was that the mutiny could spark a larger rebellion across society. While the uprising seemed to lack strong leadership or proper planning, there was one chilling realization. If the mutineers had marched on the town, there would have been nothing to stop a full-scale massacre. The British managed to regain control of Singapore by piecing together a makeshift militia. They called on whoever they could: 190 French sailors from the cruiser Montcalm, 150 sailors from 2 Japanese cruisers, a smaller group from a Russian ship, and even the private army of the Sultan of Johore. They also swore in 200 European settlers as special constables, but the Japanese took it a step further, raising 190 civilian volunteers under the imperial consul. One moment really stung for the British. Russian sailors were placed under British command and made to wear British khaki uniforms, a humiliating twist in the old rivalry of the Great Game in Asia. Later, when victory parades were held, the British tried to celebrate their regained control, but the Japanese press couldn't help but gloat. For the first time, the rising sun flag flew over Singapore. Here's a more conversational retelling of this section. This mutiny wasn't just a local event. It carried a lot of weight for those who witnessed or heard about it. The New York Times called it the biggest threat to British power in Asia since the Indian Mutiny of 1857. Meanwhile, the Times of London brought up the old fears from that era, stories of violence against European women. But in reality, only one British woman died during the Singapore Mutiny. Even that seemed accidental. She was killed after throwing herself in front of her husband to protect him. The violence itself was oddly selective. In one instance, a mutineer confronted a European volunteer, asking, "You English?" The man quickly replied, "No Irish," and they let him go. British retaliation, however, was neither selective nor subtle. It was swift and brutal. Identifying the specific perpetrators of murders wasn't easy, especially since this often involved witness like European women who weren't used to dealing with Indian soldiers. Still, 202 men were convicted after a summary general court-martial. Of these, 43 were executed and 63 were sentenced to life in exile. The executions were harsh and meant to send a message. At one public execution near Outram Road Prison, 15,000 people gathered to watch. Local volunteers and British soldiers, 5 for each condemned sepoy, formed the firing squads. But many of these men were inexperienced with close-range shooting, leading to gruesome results as the shots were scattered and ineffective. The cries of the condemned and their comrades inside the prison echoed through the grim scene. The British quickly clamped down on news of the mutiny, particularly in India, imposing a near-total blackout. An inquiry was held, but the final report was never made public. Privately, the British acknowledged what had been whispered at the time. Indian seditionists and German agents might have been stirring up trouble within the garrison. Yet even with these suspicions, there wasn't much concrete evidence to prove a larger conspiracy. Instead, the blame was placed on the unit's indiscipline, divisions between the Indian and British officers, and the weak leadership of the British commander. The British flat-out denied that the mutiny had any political significance, viewing it as a messy but isolated incident. For the British, the uprising was a chilling reminder of the violent undercurrents that propped up their empire. They preferred to see Singapore as a peaceful and liberal enclave, shielded from the chaos of the wider world. Any disruption, like this mutiny, was blamed on meddling outsiders. This narrative was carried forward in later colonial writings, which painted pre-war Singapore as a kind of golden age, especially when compared to the brutal Japanese occupation of 1942, when Indian troops abandoned by the British switched sides to form the Indian National Army. In modern, independent Singapore, the mutiny is mostly remembered as part of a broader Singapore story. It's framed as a cautionary tale about the need for constant vigilance to ensure national survival. Some local accounts emphasize the role of the police special branch in protecting the island from both external threats and internal unrest. But beyond that, the Singapore Mutiny isn't seen as a particularly significant event in the nation's history. Following the Singapore Mutiny, the British were unwilling to garrison colonies solely with Indian units, putting additional strain on their manpower. All Indians living in Singapore were required to register, which sparked resentment among a mostly loyal community. To improve Singapore's internal security, the British enacted the Reserve Force and Civil Guard Ordinance in August 1915, requiring compulsory military service from all male subjects aged 15 to 55 who were not already serving in the armed forces, volunteers, or police.